guys and girl. We covered some of this yesterday, pheromones, so we'll do a little bit more this morning with this module and then do a little assessment on it. And then we'll get into some other stuff. So this is only, there's a few slides there. There's 74 slides. So we, as I say, we did a few yesterday, so we can breeze through a few of them. That's the chapters. So, pheromones have been used in pest control in several forms over many years, but they're becoming fairly essential in the world of IPM. They're greener, pheromones don't have to have registrations as insecticides, the APVMA, because they're really for attraction or monitoring. So if you want to register anything with the APVMA, it depends, the registration or the compulsory registration depends on the claims that the manufacturers make for the products. So if there's any mention of kill, right, or eliminate or eradicate pests, that's when they've got to be registered with the APVMA. That makes sense. So with the pheromones, obviously, they don't do that, so they don't need to be registered. And it's pretty complex, the whole subject, but we'll try and simplify it a bit. So what are pheromones? They're basically chemical messengers. So pheromones are substances, if you like, that they're emitted by a particular species and they affect other species, other members of that same species. Whereas chiromones are a bit different. You've heard of chiromones? Chiromones are emitted by a species and they will have an effect on different species. So pheromones have an effect on the same species. Make sense? And obviously they work through the olfactory senses, the smell. And how are they used in pest management? So we know that pheromones can be used to monitor for stored product insects in food handling establishments. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So as we mentioned yesterday, the options that we have in IPM in food premises for monitoring are visual inspections, pheromones, which we're going to talk about, EFTs, flying insect traps, electronic flying insect traps, and food attracted traps. So here, so the first one is just us with our eyes. We attract them, in one form, through one form or another. It's just the first one where we use our eyes. And there are limitations, like everything else, there are limitations with pheromone monitoring. And it's just one of the tools in our kit. And as we spoke about yesterday, don't neglect your visual physical inspections just because you've got pheromone doers up doing the job for you. If you've got, and I'll explain one of the reasons why, so if you've got a big warehouse with finished goods in it, and you've got a full proper pheromone program installed on a grid pattern, and you're covering all sorts of pests, you've got multi-lures in, that might be hunky-dory, and you can just wander around and just check the pheromone lures, and if there's no catches on there, everything is 100% okay. Quite often that's the case, but not in every case. So let's just say we have that scenario and then something is brought in on a shipment or a delivery, or somebody opens a door and in flies an insect, stored product insect, a cigarette beetle, it could be flower beetle, whole lot of things it could be. And then that gets into a pallet of product. If that insect, let's just say it's a female beetle that's been mated, so she's ready to lay eggs. She goes to a food source, detects the food source coming out of packages and finished goods. As we said yesterday, the odours can come out of the little holes where the seams are sewn up, and lay the eggs, and the larvae hatch and away it goes. And if it's in the middle of summer, depending on the species, it doesn't take too long, it takes a few months, say 3 months, and then the infestation's established and away it goes. If there's enough, at that particular point in time, there's no competition for the food. So in that, say, pallet of food products, there's nothing else that those beetles have got to compete with. So they're happy to stay in there, right? So they've got a food supply, and if it's summer, there's enough moisture in the air with a high humidity. And as I say, there's no competition. So they just keep feeding and breeding, and it goes on and on and on. So you can, hypothetically have thousands in there before it gets to the point where the population's that big, and then some of the beetles start to leave that particular pallet and look for other feeding patches, and then they start to fly. So by the time it gets to that point, that pallet can, be really, really severely infested. Does that make sense? And of course, so there's a delayed reaction there. It could be a delayed reaction in the time that the infestation starts until the moment when the lures start to pick up the beetles that are flying around. So if you were walking around and doing your physical inspections, there's a chance that you might pick that up. You mightn't, but there's more of a chance, obviously, than if you're not doing anything and you're just relying on the pheromone lures. Does that make sense? If the pallet's up really high and it's out of your visual range, well, you're behind the 8 ball then, and you're probably going to have to wait until somebody sees the adults flying around, or you start to get catches appear on the pheromone lures, or the light units.
Does that mean we should be really pushing the customer themselves for their stock rotation and all this stuff so they can try and detect it before us?
By the time you catch them on the boards, it's too late. The product's already.
Well, it can be, yeah.
It's usually late.
Yeah. So, like Dan was saying, it comes down to good warehousing practices. So first in, first out with stock rotation. And what we were talking about yesterday, with plenty of spaces underneath the stock, on the ground, behind it, and next door to it. And you see that all the time. There's always sort of, in a lot of warehouses, there's a need for more room. You look out there, for instance, and not that there's food out there, there's not, but logistics companies like to use every bit of spare space to put stuff in. And sometimes that stuff just stays there for ages, sometimes years. So whatever it is, it goes through the expiry dates, the food goes off, it starts to grow mould because it goes off, and fungus and all sorts of microorganisms, which attracts this. It's just like pallet mice. We know what pallet mice are. So it's the same thing with mice. They get into a pallet of food in a warehouse, and they don't need a lot of moisture, mice. So if it's high humidity, right, and they've got plenty of food there, they just stay in. And mice don't really wander all that far like rats do, but I've seen it with rats too. So if they've got enough food and they're happy, they'll stay in like a pallet of food.
20 kilo bag, right?
Yeah. You pull everything apart and there's just litters of mice.
Not even a metre from the molasses area as well, so they'll set for
Yeah.
a while.
Yeah. So it's the same sort of thing. So don't neglect your other options that you have, okay, just because you've got pheromone lures up. A lot of places don't even put pheromone lures up because people aren't really that aware of them, discussed this yesterday, remember guys? We went through all those. So just quickly, you know, we can measure the results of our IPM program. Okay, particularly, you know, before adjustments or modifications are made in the plan and after those. So let's just say we got a pheromone program up and we get a pest outbreak and we've got to do something so that the tolerance, the pest activity tolerances are breached, and then we know that we've got to ramp up our measures to control whatever that is, that infestation. So we might do, usually what you would normally do would be to introduce or increase space sprays, so gassings or foggings or whatever. So you would do that, you might do a couple every week or a month or more, and monitor it as you go along. Then you get on top of it, and then you can go, and then so you go back to normal monitoring, and then you can compare what was happening before the infestation, the breakout, and your gassings to what the sort of results you're getting afterwards. That's one example.
I find it doesn't work very well. I find just finding the source is the better option.
But what's a better option?
Finding the source.
Oh,
finding
yeah.
contamination.
Yeah.
You space spray, and then you stop, and then that bag's still there.
Well, you don't. Yeah,
They
you
come
don't.
in.
You don't just do space spraying without finding the source.
Yeah, you got to find the source.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like termites, you know. So you get a termite infestation. You know, number one or the number two priority is to find the colony and find the entry point. So with this, you know, it's find the source or find the colony if you like. Yeah. Okay. And you know, it helps with physical inspections, even though I said don't neglect them, which you shouldn't. You don't have to spend so much time doing them. Because if you haven't got pheromones, the only thing you can rely on then are your light units and your physical inspections and your field tracking. We talked about this yesterday too. So it reduces the need for broadband insecticide spray, for instance. And we went through, remember we went through yesterday, we talked about cockroaches with glue traps in commercial kitchens as an analogy. Strategies. So making disruption. Now this is that, who mentioned that yesterday?
Sidetrack.
Yeah. So this is used, this is a strategy where they use the sex pheromones. And it was originally, I think all the work that they did with it was for Indian meal moth. And we can talk about moldy pheromones later, a little bit later. But so the work was done for Indian meal moth because Indian meal moth's probably the most common stored product insect. Definitely residential, domestically it is. And arguably in commercial situations as well. So this is where they did the work. And as we spoke yesterday about using sex pheromones, say for Indian meal moth, so the pheromone, the female emits the sex pheromone which attracts the males. So they've synthesised that and copied it. So the sex pheromone lures are put up in a food premise and they emit the sex pheromones the female puts out, and the objective is to attract the males and catch the males on the glue boards, so they reduce the numbers a little bit, and then over time, you know, the objective is that there's no males left, so they can't breed with the females, so the females can't lay the eggs and the infestation can't expand and increase. And during that time too, you know, we can do other measures to try and get on top of any outbreaks. But with this works a little bit differently. So they're using the same pheromone, the female sex pheromone, but they put a mass amount of pheromone lures around. So So they put them all over the place. And what happens is that the whole space is just filled with female sex pheromones. So the males can't zero in on the females. Of course, there's so much of this stuff everywhere. So normally there'd be, areas and spaces in between where the sex pheromones were wafting around. So the males could come through an area where there's none, and of course they're attracted to where the pheromones are being emitted from these lures. So the closer they get to the lures, the more pheromone they're picking up, so they end up going to the lures. With this, they can't find the lures because there's so much of this sex pheromone wafting around. And of course, if they can't find females, because there's just this maze of pheromone everywhere, they can't breed with them. Does that make sense so far? So that's the theory behind it. That's the way it works. And what you do, well, I'll go back. The problem that I can see with it, I've never used this particular system, is that where's your data? So if you've got, what I mean by that, if you've got these lures everywhere putting out all these pheromones, you're not going to attract any males to those.
It doesn't lead you to the source.
Those traps. So you've got no data, so it's very difficult to measure what sort of results you're getting. Does that make sense? So over a period of time, hopefully, the numbers would just naturally decrease. But from my perspective, I just find it to be difficult to, to track it properly and get a clear picture. Like you just have to guess, and you have to think, well shit, have the numbers gone down or have they not? But they're selling it and people are using it, so I don't know what sort of results they're getting, but they're making money out of it. And I remember they introduced it at one of the conferences a few years back, one of the AF, the national conferences. The guy came over from the States and he did a talk on it. And in question time, I sort of said to him, well, how does it work? Like, tell us how you use it. I said, I explained that to him. And I said, so, for these big food operations where we need data, we need trend analysis, right, on our activity. So as we can review that, evaluate that, and then improve things going forward. This is what auditors look for. So I said, what happens with that? So he said, well, what you can do is put this stuff all through the middle. So say we've got a warehouse with finished goods everywhere. So you put a mass of these things everywhere in the middle of all your stock. And then around the perimeter on the walls you might put your ordinary system. So for flying insects, say at 12 to 15 metre intervals along the perimeter walls, we put our normal ones. So we can, in other words, with the perimeter ones, in our traditional way of monitoring for the insects, we can catch them, right? But in the middle, we can't because there's too many in there. So does that make sense? Did I explain that right? So around the perimeter here, we've got our usual setup, but in the middle we've got this mass trapping or mating disruption setup with all the pheromones. So they maintain that, in the middle it's all right. They can't find any pheromone traps there because there's pheromones everywhere. But if you want data and figures and numbers, just put them around the walls and they'll go to those.
That makes no sense.
But like, where does all that match pheromone in the middle stop? And then you start to have gaps with your ones on the wall, and vice versa. Like,
Put a big imaginary wall there.
yeah, which you haven't. So that's sort of a problem that I personally have with it. But as I say, they've been using it in some places. Any questions? Did I explain that okay? You understand that? Okay, the mass trapping. So this is where, let's say we've got an organic certified food site, and they've got big issues there with soil product insects. So you can't use insecticides, or that you're very limited in what you can use. Anybody know what you can use in organic sites or organic sites in the way of pesticides?
Sometimes it could be through. Sometimes.
Internally, you can't use anything, it's clean.
You can, they have got, and we'll get to this in a little while, in the next module, but you can use DE, diatomaceous earth. You can use boracic acid, or borax, and you can use water-based pyrethrin, natural pyrethrin. It's got no solvents or emulsifiers or anything else in it. So that's the only three that you can use. So, okay, so back to our scenario, we've got a big infestation, we can't use chemicals, so we decide, well, we're going to trap them all. So, again, we'll just say cigarette beetle. So we're using sex pheromones there, female sex pheromones. Does it work? Well, they've tried it, and they have had some success. This is on a global basis, but apparently, you know, it's not too popular because it's really, really costly. Now, you're not using chemicals, so there's no cost for the chemicals that you normally be spraying, but we know that, you know, insecticides usually aren't a big component of the costing for a service. But these things are quite expensive. So, you know, if you're changing, I don't know, 300 pheromone lures every week or every fortnight, it's a lot of money. So that's why it really doesn't catch on. They have done, as I say, they've done it. It has worked in a few trials, but it's taken like a year and a half, for instance, just as an example of time frames. If you had a really little place, arguably, you know, it could be an option, as long as they're not too impatient, because it takes a while. Any questions? Lure and kill. So pheromones can be used to lure specific pests to a surface or trap where there's an elimination process in play. Could be in the form of a surface treated with residual insecticide with a pheromone lure attached. A sticky film which is impregnated with a pheromone and or an insecticide, so they get attracted to that film and obviously get stuck on it. So I haven't really seen that. I don't know if, of course I don't buy stuff anymore. My son, my family company buys it, but so I'm not really sure what's available now. But FMC, a few years ago, I was over their head office and they showed me a product which was like a transparent Band-Aid, but you know, so big, about 4 inches by 8 inches, say, and you would stick it on the window. And of course, if you've got flies inside, as we know, those house flies, they'll get attracted to the UV light coming through the windows and try and fly through it. So that's one attraction. But also, it's got pheromones in it, so fly pheromones in it. So muscimane, perhaps, I can't remember what the pheromone was for flies. But yeah, so they get attracted to this thing and they get stuck on the film, and you just peel it off and throw it in the bin and put more up. So that's like an example where they use pheromone for the elimination. I mean, if you think about it, a pheromone lures this, right? Because they've got a sticky, and a lot of them, they've got a sticky surface, and then they've got the pheromone there. But they've got other forms of it, basically, what we're saying here. And the pheromones can be used to enhance UV light insect traps as well. those glue boards that they have, you know, with the electronic fly traps, they could have arguably a pheromone impregnated into that glue surface on the board, which would enhance the capture. They probably wouldn't want it because it'd be too costly in the manufacturer, and they've got the UV lamps there to attract the insects anyway.
I think Brandenburg did it for a little while.
Yeah, how did it work?
No. Still the same. They were still full every time you went there.
Yeah, yeah.
And, sorry, I always forget, LED lights are not as effective on stock product that
Yeah.
we're using, yeah.
Well, I don't know, I haven't used the LEDs, but all the research I've done, that's basically what it says, more or less.
Yeah.
You know, the trials are ongoing, but yeah, they don't seem to work as well as the,
Not bright enough, so it's basic, yeah. Bright enough, you know,
For our eyes. That's the thing for our eyes.
So, so we don't need to cover this again today, folks, do we? We did, yeah, everybody sort of clear on the sex pheromones? Okay, so, okay. So what are the sex pheromones used for with pheromone programs?
Adults with a short lifespan.
Yeah, short, so insects with a short adult lifespan, yeah? We've got that. Some examples of those species of insects. Anybody want to give a few examples?
Indian moth,
Yep. Indian meal moth.
Mediterranean flower.
Yep. All the pyrolid family of moths, yeah. So Plodia, Ephesia, Hedra, Psittodroga. Anything else? How about any of the Coleoptera? First of all, what is Coleoptera?
The warehouse beetles and the carrier beetles.
They're in that group, yeah. That's right. But what does Coleoptera suggest? What is that title representing? It's just all the insects that are beetles and weevils, basically. Yeah. So it's Latin, like all this Latin stuff for plants and animals out there. They all have Latin names. Why do you think they have Latin names?
genus.
Well, genus, they have species and genus and families and subfamilies and order, orders and phylum and what have you. So Coleoptera is an order. So it starts, you know, at the kingdom at the top and works down. So phylum like an Arthropoda, which is the insects. And then it comes down, there's something else in between. Then there's the orders. So for beetles and weevils, it's Coleoptera. For the moths and the butterflies, it's what? Lepidoptera, yeah. Flies. Diptera, yeah. Termites.
That's the question, is it gonna count terminate, or is it pushing up to planet A?
No, that's the families.
Families.
Yeah, so this is further up the ladder. Yeah, further up the scale.
Because they're now coming out of planet
Well, Bladder are the cockroaches.
Yes, right.
So termites are Isoptera, although what they've decided to do in the last few years is put the termites under Bladder.
just to confuse me.
Yeah, and they do this
It's easy
really
to solve jobs to house moles when you say that.
Yeah. So that's what that's all about. But why do we have Latin, do you reckon?
That's why people seem smart.
Well, back
It's more universal, isn't it?
back with Linnaeus and all the other scientists that put together these big classifications and charts of life on Earth, the international language back then was sort of Latin. None of us can speak it here, well I can't, but so that's what they decided to use because it was universal, more or less. Even though I'm sure not many Chinese could have spoken Latin back then, or Mongolians or whatever, or the Vikings, but still, that's what they chose Latin because it was this stuff, originated. So that's what's used. So any plant or any animal or any organism now, and for a long time, for a few centuries, has had a Latin name. And if you use the Latin name, it's distinct, it's unique, and you can't go wrong. So if you go like overseas to different conferences in our industry and you talk to other people, they'll have a different common name, for an insect species to our common name. And it gets really, really confusing. So that's why if everybody uses Latin, there can't be any sort of confusion about it. Everybody knows what we're talking about with this particular species with the Latin name. So it's basically why they use it. Okay, so that's the lure and kill. Sex pheromone, yeah. So we've gone through that. Yeah, so the moths, so Indian meal moth, the pyralid moths, so the almond moth, tobacco moth, the tropical warehouse moth, the anguis, flower moth, yeah, all those moths. But cigarette beetles, warehouse beetles, drugstore beetles, they're coleoptera, so they're beetles, but they've got short adult lifespans. So sex pheromones are used for them, as opposed to aggregation pheromones, which, for the other species with, what are aggregation pheromones used for?
Food.
They work on a different species to the,
And what differentiates those two groups, if you like, of insects? The adult lifespan. Okay? Yeah. So the aggregation pheromones, as we said yesterday, they attract insects that really, they're not so intent on mating because they have more time, they have a much longer adult lifespan, and they're more concerned with feeding, with food and nutrition, and of course finding a good place to procreate. So breed, and a good spot for the female to lay the eggs, so when the eggs hatch, there's a ready food source there for the larvae. Okay? Whereas with the sex pheromones ones, with the insects with a short adult lifespan, their whole mission in life is to breed. Because, in some cases they've only got a week or two. Yeah? Okay. So the history of pheromones. So in the 1950s, scientists snipped off thousands of silkworm, Bombyx mori, genitalia, to extract their pheromone in order to synthesize it. So that's where they started. So more than 2,000 pheromones have been identified since then, and that's just an example of an angler spider, a bowler spider, who mimics the sex pheromone emitted by female moths, and that attracts the male moths to its web. So it just sits in the web, puts out this female pheromone, and the moths come to it, and just, as long as it's got its food. The first two pheromones that were commercially available, synthesised and commercially available, were for the Indian meal moth and the warehouse beetle. So those two pheromones are actually, they work in combination well. So, they're compatible, if you like. So instead of buying like a whole lot of pheromones to monitor for Indian meal moth, a whole lot to do warehouse beetle, different ones, a whole lot to do cigarette beetle and so on, which would cost a fortune, they do make multi-species lures, so you can monitor it for, as an example, 10 different species with the one monitor, or the one pheromone lure. Make sense? So, the two pheromones that are, that apply to these two species, to the meal moth and the warehouse beetle, attract between them about 20 different species. So the thing to always look for if you're gonna, put in pheromone programs are multi-species lures. So they can make the most out of the lures and the whole program. So we talk a bit about what's available. So these are the moth pots, and they have like a pheromone that goes in the little tab up the top here. So they have different. They have 4 different colours, so different one for each season of the year to help you, track when you change the last one. And then in there, so that comes off, and you can put there's a sticky board, glue board that wraps around inside. You just stick it in there, or you can put soapy water in there, or whatever you like. And these are some of the Russell IPM lures. So this is pre-baited diamond traps with different pheromone combinations. So that's another one that obviously you just hang it up. It's a multi-species lure. And this is another one where you open that up and it comes with a little, I don't know what you call them, but a little capsule, and you put that capsule in, because in there you can't see it, but there's glue in that pheromone trap, and you put the capsule in there which attracts them, and shut it, and there's holes in the side, and they go in through the holes and get attracted to the pheromone and get caught on the glue. They do make those for moths, for clothing moths. So webbing clothes, we know what case-making clothes moths are, and webbing clothes moths. So for the tinier species, the webbing clothes moth, they make a really good pheromone, and they use it in this particular trap. It works really, really well. And the multi-lures, which we've discussed a little bit. So again, we've got the Indian meal moth and the warehouse beetle there. So multi-lures are cost effective, as we've discussed. And pheromones which attract Indian meal moth, and we discussed that. Between them, they attract about 20 different species. So which pheromone trap to use? It can be a little bit involved. How to know which pheromone trap to use? If unsure, read the product label. Just like we do with insecticides, pesticides.
Wouldn't you start, myself, I would start with what product the client storing?
Yeah.
Is where I'd start.
But if you think about it, on the product label, they take all that into consideration. So the manufacturers, right, they produce a pheromone product to attract certain insect species. And obviously with that, they do the research and they know what sort of foods that they're going to be, attracted to. But the whole thing is that if you buy pheromone lures, let's just say you bought pheromone lures and you thought, well, I'm gonna monitor for, let's say there's an outbreak for sawtooth grain beetle, right? So they don't fly, so you would buy some pitfall traps or fraud traps for them, and you looked around for a product and it had, say, weevil on it, flat grain beetle maybe, a few other insect species, but it didn't have sawtooth grain beetle on it, and you put them in a big warehouse where they had a really serious problem and it didn't work, right? And they'd say, well, you've done the wrong thing here. And you'd say, well, no. And they'd say, well, let's have a look at the product you've used. And of course, you look at the manufacturer's label for directions, it hasn't got sawtooth grain beetle. You've lost the argument. So, and as we said yesterday, there are species where they haven't got a pheromone lure yet for them. And the sawtooth grain beetle's one of them. So there is a few. As I said yesterday, the drugstore beetle, apparently it's pretty hard to synthesise, so they haven't had really good success with the pheromones that the pheromone products that they've produced for that. So, look at the label, think about the target species, think about the shelf life of the lure, think about the replacement frequency, and installation positioning and distance apart. But how do we know what the target species are? Well, we're back to our site risk analysis. So what susceptible foods are on site, and then identify what insects feed on those foods. So let's just say somebody gave you a box of pheromone lures and the information as to which species you were monitoring for was missing. That probably wouldn't work. Let's just say, I can't really come up with a good scenario because most products have got directions for use on them. But if you were unsure, you would look at what foods are on site and then do your research if you didn't know and find out what species are going to be attracted to those foods and then look around for a pheromone lure that was, manufactured for those species, monitor for those species. And analyse the species and habits and life cycles. So, as we said before, are they Coleoptera or are they Lepidoptera? So are they beetles, weevils, or are they moths? Are they attracted to sex or aggregation pheromones? So this bullet point depends on this bullet point. And of course, do they fly? So in addition, you might have some pheromone lures that you did the research and you know that they have long adult lifespans, so you use pheromone lures with aggregation pheromones and you put them in, but you use one that you elevate or hang up on racking or whatever, and of course they don't fly. You're not going to get many. So you've got to think about, their behaviour as well as their life cycle. Make sense? And of course, as we said yesterday, the species that do fly, when the temperature drops to say 20 degrees, it varies a little bit, but they stop flying, the species that do. So most of them will fly, the ones that do fly, when the temperature gets to say 21. But if it's 1 or 2 degrees below that, they won't fly readily. So even though, you might have the pheromone lure suitable for them in normal conditions, if the temperatures are down a little bit and those pheromone lures are hanging type, you're not going to get them all. You're not going to get them into light units either. So then what have we got to use? We've got to use floor traps, big floor traps. And, more of a chance of getting them when they're crawling around. And if there's no pheromone, the option is to use food attractants. Make sense?
If you've got like a grain, say like a weevil, and you use an aggregation of pheromones, would you still get the pheromone if the food source was still there?
If they say that,
If there was like a baker's delight or something, like grain or a cereal or something like weevils, and you're using the pheromones, would you still get it in the pheromone if the food source was still there?
you'll get them in the pheromone, but they'll still be in the food. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Would they go to the pheromone if the food source was still
You
there?
probably wouldn't get them all coming out of the food and going into the lures.
To try to eliminate that.
Yeah, it'd be nice if you did, but
I know I baker's delight was just
yeah, but definitely you would. In places like that, you would need pheromone lures up, just to know what you're dealing with as soon as you get a bit of a pest outbreak. Provided that they're doing their housekeeping correctly. Because remember what we said before? They could get into something and stay there unnoticed if they've got everything they need in that feeding patch. Yeah. Okay. So, choose the trap based on all of the above and considering the following. So, whole grains, and we'll get into this on day tomorrow, which is day 3. So we get into the different, because I don't want to confuse you at the moment, but we've got big general groups of stored product insects, and the differentiation is dependent upon their feeding patterns and their behaviour. So we've got what's called primary pests and secondary pests. So the primary pests are like the weevils, the lesser grain borer, the flower moth, Angimus flower moth, Pseudotroga. And the difference is that they spend their whole life cycle inside the grain kernel or the rice kernel, whereas others will be outside. So they don't spend all the larval and pupal stage of the life cycle inside the actual food kernel. Does that make sense? And within those primary feeders or those primary pests, we've got internal feeders and external feeders. So we have primary insects that are considered primary, but they also feed on the outside and not necessarily on the inside of the grain kernel or the rice kernel. And then you've got the secondary pests, which, you know, aren't as common, don't do as much damage normally. You know, finished products, all the different ingredients, residues and all that sort of thing. But we'll get into that on the third day. So that's why the whole grains are up there. So wheat, rice and seeds, oil seeds for instance, they're attractive to weevils, the lesser grain borer and the granary moth. So the granary moth, it's the Angimus granary moth. That's a French word. It comes from a particular region over there in France, and it's the only moth that we deal with that really spends its life cycle inside the grain kernel. So all the other moths, they feed on the outside, and they're secondary feeders, but this one's a primary pest because it's an internal feeder. So it's the only one. So that's the ones with the whole grapes. In this scenario above, sex pheromones are needed for the granary moth because it has a short adult lifespan. So this is where it can get confusing, okay? So because you've got these other species that are primary pests, spend their life cycle inside the grain kernel, and they have a long adult lifespan, we use aggregation pheromones. But for the granary moth, it's also a primary pest and it spends its life cycle inside the grain kernel. But because it's got a short adult lifespan, we use a sex pheromone law for that. So it can get a little bit confusing. And how do you get over that confusion? Well, we go back to the previous slide. We look at the directions for use on the manufacturer's products, for one.
And what about corn? Where would you put corn?
Corn,
Yeah.
or corn, maize, corn,
Yeah.
yeah. So the species that are attacked at, well, the products produced from corn would be attractive to a lot of pests.
Yeah.
But the maize weevil, for instance, is a big pest, obviously, of maize or corn. Aggregation pheromones with a food attractant for the weevils and lesser grain borer. So they have a long adult lifespan. Okay, so install traps that contain both pheromones and a food attractant? No, it's still not that simple. Pheromone traps do not usually combine both sex and aggregation pheromones. Because those pheromones aren't compatible with each other, you won't be able to find lures that have both of them there. So there's going to be a limitation on the the species that you're going to be able to monitor for with any particular one. Some traps combine an aggregation pheromone with a food attractant, like the RTUs, the MST RTUs that go on the floor. They've got the vegetable oil in them, then they've got another food attractant tablet, and then they've got a pheromone attractant tablet. So that's where they've combined food attractant and the pheromone. Hanging traps are the flying species, obviously, and the floor traps are for the crawling ones. Any questions, guys?
Just one, with the pheromones, you've got two, like pheromones, sex and aggregation.
Yeah.
Is there a, like if you had your hanging ones up and then you had floor ones down, do they sort of counteract each other or make them less effective to different type of pheromones?
They could. If you had a good example. Well, if you had hanging ones, you've got the hanging ones up there. Hanging ones would attract weevils but not the granary weevil, because it doesn't fly, remember? But the maize weevil and the rice weevil do. So a hanging one would attract if it had aggregation pheromones, attract those weevils, those two species, but it wouldn't attract the granary weevil. So you have, a full track of the granary weevil. So with that, they're distinctive. You'd probably get some of the maize weevil and the rice weevil in the floor trap as well as the hanging ones, but you wouldn't get the granary weevil in the elevated one because they don't fly. Although the weevils are the most mobile of all, so they can crawl up things. Not glass, but they can crawl up a lot of surfaces. So if you get if you've ever come across, or if you ever do come across weevils, a big weevil infestation, they're just all over the place. They're crazy.
Yeah, even your flying ones, and even though they don't fly, some of the maize ones, they're still in them.
Yeah, they're really mobile.
What about red-legged handbirds?
Yeah, the red, it's not a really common pest. I mean, we do have it here. I don't think I've ever done a job with it.
Yeah, we had one a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's in the, not nutrient ag, so going from 4 different sites.
Yeah.
It's in a dog food.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Get a lot of stuff in pet foods. Indian meal moth. Actually, the litter stuff that you get for cats and put in the trays, that's really attractive to Indian meal moth.
Yeah, there's a hemp seed
Yeah.
at Newcastle, and they've got, it's just unbelievable. You can't breathe.
Yeah.
There's that many of them.
Yeah. Okay. So establish the species that you monitor for and search for a corresponding pheromone lure. Okay? So we work out what species, so we've got a pest outbreak in a warehouse. We know which species they are, we've identified them. So then we look around for the pheromone lures that are compatible with those species. So, most of the food moths, the warehouse beetle, the cigarette beetle, and the carpet beetles are often combined in multi-lures. Okay. Actually, the carpet beetle shouldn't be there because they use aggregation pheromones. I'll have to take that out because they've got a long adult lifespan. So the others are normally combined in multi-lures quite often. And the aggregation pheromones are the weevils, the lesser grain borer, and the flower beetles. So confused flower beetle, rust red flower beetle. All good? If there is a pheromone lure available, should it be hung or should it be floor mounted? Now we discussed this, and this depends on whether it flies. So that's just a couple of lists of the species that fly and the ones that don't. So, if we look at the weevils, for instance, which we've discussed, the rice and maize weevils fly, but the granary weevil doesn't. The confused flower beetle doesn't fly, but the rust red flower beetle does. And the capra beetle doesn't fly, but the warehouse beetle does. So these are the same genus, but different species. Yet one flies and the other one doesn't. It's just one of those things in nature, I guess. Any questions? And obviously, spider beetles don't fly. And we discussed the other ones. Springtails don't fly. What about book lice? So a book lice, a stored product, insect. Anybody want to have a stab at it? They are. So book lice, if you know anything about them, they feed on microscopic fungus and mildew and molds. So when you get cellulose materials like books and cardboard and stuff like that, in a damp, high humidity situation, they'll grow little microscopic moulds on the paper, which we can't necessarily see. Sometimes we can smell it, but we can't see it. That's what they feed on that sort of thing. So when you've got grain that's stored at temperatures which we'll get to later, too high and or at too moist, the grains grow microscopic moulds and fungus and other disease pathogens which attract book flies. So book flies are a pretty important species of stored grain, and they're becoming more so. So, do they fly? I think was my original question. Well, some do and some don't. So again, we've got species of book flies, zooids, that fly, and other species that don't. Confusing?
John Duck.
Yeah, okay. So that's that. Excellent again. Ready, so RTU is ready to use, and X-Lure is just the brand name for it, but that's a multi-species lure. Designed to be suspended, obviously, comes in a pack of 5. So they're the species that it monitors for. Okay, so let's go through those. Indian meal moth, Mediterranean flower moth, brazen moth, tobacco moth, cigarette beetle, capra beetle, and warehouse beetle. What's the common denominator with these guys?
They're flying.
Pardon?
They're flying.
They fly? No. Yeah. So they've got the short adult lifespan.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's got sex pheromones in it. Is a long way of saying that. And it's infused into the glue coating on the surface.
They might attract anything that's an aggregation.
They've got sex pheromones. Yeah, so they won't work on the species that are, where they normally use aggregation pheromones because they've got such a long adult lifespan.
Yeah, I think that seems to be the most common one that we sell. Or
Yeah.
that some people sell, and
Yeah.
they go with that even they've got something that's not even going to go to it.
Yeah.
So, aggregation.
If you look at those species up there, that little list of them, arguably that's probably the most common stored product insects. Although, if you think about it, weevils can, be common, and the flower beetles, Tribolium are really common, and the grain beetles are too. So, it just depends on the situation. But I suppose if you had to say what are the most prevalent 2 species of stored product insects, it'd probably be the Indian meal moth and the cigarette beetle, because they both have such a wide array of food preferences, so they'll eat just about anything, both of them. A crawling insect. So this is, remember the one I showed you with the glue in it and a couple of tablets? There it is there. So that's how it sits in. So that's the capsule, if you like, or the holder for it. So you've used these? Yeah. So they just come apart, and the inserts just slip in there, pull a film off the top, and they just, sit in there. So it's got pheromones and food attractants in it. The cartridges that go inside are sold separately. Comes in a box of 5 and 5 cartridges. So that's the species up there that these monitor for. So we've got grey weevils, rice weevils, maize weevils, that's a grain borers, sawtooth grain beetles, drugstore beetle, flowering grain beetles. Yeah. probably shouldn't be in there. So this is taken from their labels.
Didn't you say the sawtooth didn't have a pheromone? Did it?
The drugstore beetle?
The sawtooth.
Sawtooth, yeah,
So,
yeah.
okay.
That's what's on their label. So their labels sometimes are a bit misleading and you scratch your head.
Semantics.
But I said all small product beetles.
Yeah.
Well,
So you know,
That's the semantics.
what's the thinking with that? Maybe they just think, well, we'll just put it on and people won't, they'll be none the wiser, maybe. Yeah. So the grain weevils, right, don't fly, for one. They've got a long adult life span as the rice weevils and the maize weevils, although they do fly, okay? So the lesser grain bore's got a long adult life span and it flies. The sawtooth grain beetle has a long adult lifespan, but it doesn't fly. The drugstore beetle has got a short adult lifespan, right? So sex pheromones should work for that. But as we discussed, it's so hard to find one. They haven't been able to produce a really reliable one, yet they've got the drugstore beetle in here too. So you've got all of these species apart from the drugstore beetle that aggregation pheromones are used for, and yet they've got the drugstore beetle in there which sex pheromones are used for.
So that just comes back to the food attractants.
That shouldn't be, yeah. And it also provides harbourage, so they get attracted to that as well. Yeah. So, as we said before, that's right. So sometimes if there's not a pheromone, so I'll put a food attractant in a tray. Okay. Yeah, I'll get that up there yesterday, yeah. So you've got to number your pheromone limits too, just like you do with all your other devices, guys. Yep. What to use if no pheromone lure is available? Use food attractants.
We used to call them blunder traps.
Yeah. Yeah, blunder traps, yeah. They just wander up and fall in. So examples, as we said. So we got the grain beetles there. They're mostly grain beetles. And we've got the variegated carpet beetle. They've got a pheromone for the black carpet beetle, from memory. I've never used it, but not one for the variegated carpet beetle. So there's two species. Actually, they're different genus. Yeah, because you've got Adigenus unicolor for the black carpet beetle and Anthrenus verbasci for the variegated carpet beetle. So they're different species and different genuses. They've got a pheromone for one but not for the other. But we don't need to worry too much about that. Yeah. So we discussed these. So there's the list. Obviously, we've spoken about the drugstore beetle. So the springtail, right, there's no pheromone for that. The flower mite, Acurosira, there's no pheromone lure for that. The book lice, so that's the species, Hypsicellus species, so they don't fly, those ones. So there's no pheromone for them. Obviously spider beetles, well they don't fly, but there's no pheromone for them. Larder beetle, same thing, which is a dermistic beetle. The cadell, none for that. None for the flat grain beetle, or not readily available. So they might exist, but they're not really commercially available. And if they are, they're probably not all that effective. So that's just the species. You've got to hopefully try and remember that, there's really no pheromone for it. So, yeah, I don't want to confuse you more, but so springtails, flower mite and sosids, they're fungus and mold feeders. Yeah,
Yeah, I've always seen them outside in the leaf mulch and
yeah,
stuff.
because you often get them on foods that are, or in food where you've got food residue, and then you've got mould growing on that because it's wet or it's moist or there's high humidity. Yeah.
Just a thought, Gary, I mean, not that we get a lot of calls about book lice, but you do get people in offices sometimes calling saying, you know, they've had moisture in paper, stored paper and whatnot, and they're complaining they've got them. Would a mould treatment, you know, like, because I'm working around Lismore, we had massive mould issues up there, and when we were doing mould treatments, would that in theory kill off book lice?
It would kill off the mould,
Yeah, which,
so that's their food source,
Yeah.
so it would help.
yeah,
But, yeah, so there you're dealing with the source, which is a good way to go.
yeah,
But then can you keep that up?
yeah.
You know,
Like I've got to get rid of the moisture first.
yeah, I've seen book lice like a really big job on a private college years ago, and in their dormitory, it was on Tara School for Girls at North Parramatta. They had everybody was infested inside the dormitory, and what happened was they had outside up against the wall, it was a double brick cavity wall, and they had a watering system there on a garden with plants in it and bark chip. So it was watered all the time. The moisture went through, the water went through and sat under the bark chip, so it was moist all the time. And then you've got the bark chip there, so it sort of grew moulds and fungus on it, and it attracted the book lice. So they were breeding out there by the billions in the garden, and they were climbing up the walls and going through the perk joints and the brickwork and stuff, and going through the cavity and coming up around the architraves, and they were on the windowsills and down on the carpets, and they were crawling across to the beds where the girls were staying. And it was so bad, so they just migrated through the whole place. So we had to, we used some gassings and stuff inside. They did some residual treatments on the walls inside. I think probably used deltamethrin. And on the windowsills, I can't really remember what we used, it was a long time ago. But then outside we got them to take up the bark chip. So they took the bark chip up, they stopped the watering system there, and over a period of time fixed it right up. And I don't think they had a recurrence with it. So, because they feed on the mould and the fungus and the mildews. So yeah, I've got a whole training module on book lice, but we probably won't have time to do it. Yeah. So if you, okay, we're off track a bit, but everybody's probably had complaints from a customer that says they're being bitten by something and nobody can, right? We've all had it. Sometimes it's book lice, but other times it can be a whole range of things, right? That they're not associating, or they're associating with the inside of their house, but they might be occurring outside. So it could be mozzies or midges. It could be stuff in fertilisers, ingredients in fertilisers that they've been out gardening. All these sorts of things. In wintertime, it could be static electricity with carpets, you know, that they're getting itchy. And of course, once they get itchy, they scratch it, and then it breaks the surface of the skin, and then the bacteria in front of their fingernails gets into the, you know, scratches, and it gets worse. But sometimes it is book lice, and the best way I found over the years is to just take blue boards in wherever it is, because you know I've seen technicians and pest control companies that have done jobs 5 or 6 times, like they've nuked the place inside and out, and you know the customer's still got problems. So quite often the way to resolve it was we just get glue boards, take them out to the areas inside the house where they said that they were getting bitten or they thought they were getting bitten, and put them down, leave them there for a couple of days, come and collect them up, and then look at them under, say, a field microscope, and quite often there's nothing on there. Sometimes there is, sometimes there's book lice on there, but yeah, so that's the best way to do it. There is a thing called, I forgot the word for it now. I'll look it up later. But it's a human psychological condition.
So it's like a sensitive.
Yeah, but there's a specific name for it.
Nathan Jeffrey knows it.
Yeah.
Keeps telling me, and I can't
It's something parasitosis from memory, but I'll look it up later. So quite often it's, well, not quite often, but occasionally you get a customer that has that. You can't do anything.
And then they start throwing their skin with the tin more sand.
Yeah,
Yeah. Or we go spray John's bed through it, and
Yeah.
they start going in.
Delusional parasitosis it is. Yeah. Anyway. Any questions, guys? Are we okay? I don't know whether I'll get into this, right? Look. So the question is, do we really want to get into that much detail with all these groups of store product insects?
Can we follow it though?
Yeah.
Is there like, stored product pest is probably one, like some of us have got really good knowledge. And is there a source that you would recommend that gives the best, website or, there's so much on the internet
Yeah.
and it's,
Yeah, there's stuff that the American military's done for their bases, where they got their troops. They've done a lot of research into it.
even like an identification, like for our technicians, I
Yeah,
suppose,
it's there.
to go, does it fly?
If you got on the web, you'd be able to find out if you put in stored product. If you go to say Google Scholar, has anybody heard of Google Scholar? So you know how you have ordinary Google? If you go to Google and put in Google Scholar, it's another search engine within Google, right? And it's for more academically inclined publications, So you can go there. But you get Purdue University and Kentucky University in the US have done quite a lot of work. In Australia, there's the Grains Research Organisation. I can't remember the exact title of it. But they're pretty good. But with this stuff, I put these slides together a few years ago, just as a summary for the different groups. So, we've got the moths. You can take photos if you like. We've got the flower beetles. Just as a point of interest, flower beetles, for whatever reason, I don't know why, are the hardest to control with insecticides. So they seem to be more tolerant than the other species on insecticides. So when they do trials with stored product insects, they seem to always include flower beetles because they're so tolerant of a lot of the insecticides, whereas a lot of the other species. And they're really slow moving as well. So as I said, the weevils are really, really fast and mobile. The grain beetles are slower than the weevils, but then you've got the flower beetles and they're even slower still.
So will that come down to metabolic rate? So that the old theory, like if you get bitten by a snake, you just lay still, and it slowly works through your system and it doesn't fuck you up.
Yeah, could be. Metabolism might have something to do with it, yeah. Grain beetles. If you see anything here in any of these slides you want to talk about, just sing out, guys. We could go right through them and discuss it all, but it takes a long time, Or we could come back to it tomorrow if we get it, time, if you want. Weevils.
I know we have customers that we go and spray and we do everything, we mist, we do everything, but I've never seen a need where you're not using them as monitors, you're finding the source, you're disposing of the source. Treatments aren't really needed.
Yeah, although it depends how big the infestation is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's one bag on a pallet,
Yeah.
and it's just a matter of break it down.
Well, it depends on what sort of product it is. Quite often they're in finished products. And as I mentioned yesterday, it depends a lot on the packaging. So you might go up to a pallet Or pallets might come in with shrink wrap around them, as they do, to keep it all together, and you'll find some insects, you know, or larvae, or both underneath the shrink wrap.
Yeah.
And obviously you take that off and start to pull. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily in the product inside.
That's
the
right,
package,
exactly,
you know.
yeah. So you might be throwing that shrink wrap away
Yeah,
and clean up,
that's
it's not
right.
like you brush them all off,
Yeah,
and that's no treatment needed.
yeah,
Sometimes a vacuum cleaner,
yeah.
that's about it.
But you know, you can't just accept that they're not in the packets, that's the thing.
Yeah.
And it can come down to what sort of packaging material it is too.
But then you're gonna recommend fumigation maybe, all the sprays and that we basically do aren't gonna help in that packaging.
Yeah, 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 fumigation, it's costly and it's a lot of work, you know, and, you know, quite often they'll throw the product out anyway afterwards, so.
Can you
Fumigation's good, it works really, really well, but,
Can you phrase these, because I'm not gonna name names, but there is a large customer I've been to and you've probably eaten their products. They got a bad infestation of sawtooth grain beetle in their dates, and they did not wanna throw them out because they couldn't send them back to the supplier because they, because by the time they'd opened them, they were past that period, and when they opened them, I mean, they were just crawling with the sawtooth grain beetles. The solution was to put them in a container and freeze them and then use them, and hopefully the bad beetles would just get mashed up into production and you'd never see them, which is what they
Yeah.
did. But
yeah.
the question that we had was always that I said to them, look, you'll probably kill the adults, but I couldn't guarantee that with the eggs that they couldn't reanimate because I just didn't have that kind of knowledge.
Yeah.
But that was the question, whether the eggs could reanimate, and then as soon as they thaw out and they're set back in the warm warehouse, whether the infestation just starts again.
That'd be hard to say, actually. It would probably depend largely on the production process with whatever products they were using from it. So in other words, were they using a lot of heat?
Yeah, so once they freeze them, and then they just, from there we're gonna go to manufacturers, they would have been cooked, so they wouldn't have come out of that process. But it was just that once they pulled them out of the freezer, sat them back into the warehouse and brought them back up to room temperature again, and they could be sitting there for weeks. I said to them I couldn't guarantee that the eggs wouldn't reanimate and just hatch,
Yeah.
because we didn't know whether freezing would kill them.
It depends on how long and what temperature they kept them at. So do you know what temperature it was?
They put it in the freezing container, so it would have been down to about -18.
Okay, for how long?
A few days, I think.
That's okay, because.
Probably should have been, and again, this is where the research varies quite a lot
Exactly.
when you look at it. So, and we'll get into this a bit later today, but -20 for a week is a good rule of thumb.
Because they were putting them in as whole pallets, and I said that was your other problem, that by the time the cool gets into the centre, it could be a week maybe before you even,
Yeah.
the centre of the stock actually got
Yeah.
frozen, because the pallet, the
Yeah.
container was so packed full.
Yeah, it does depend a bit on the product and how dense it is, obviously. But as a bit of a rule of thumb, this is my rule of thumb on everything that I've, you know, experienced and everything that I've read. Because this is the thing, with some of these subjects, you'll do all your research and you'll come out the other end of it scratching your head, because you get different opinions and different trials and different research outcomes, and you think, well, shit, you know, like, what's right and what's wrong? So you can't teach that sort of stuff. In my view, I don't want to say to people, well, you know, this is what they found here, this is what they found here, this is what they found here, this is what they found here. Because you'll just go away scratching your head too, and that's probably, you know, not the sort of info that you want. So you've got to try and, I don't know, get a happy medium, if you like, on a few of these things, a few of these subjects. So have a bit of a benchmark or a baseline that you can work off. Because there's so many, you know, variations, contributing factors on it all. But with the temperature, yeah, 20 degrees, -20 degrees for a week, or -10 for 2 weeks, is generally enough to cure all the stages of the life cycles of the soil product insects. And with heat, it's different. It goes the other way. The heat's a bit like bed bugs. So you read all the different opinions about what's the right temperature and what's the duration for using heat with bed bugs, and that varies a lot too. But you know, with heat, with altered gases like CO2 and oxygen, or CO2, not oxygen, it's oxygen depletion, but it's and heat and cold and fumigation, it's concentration times multiplied by duration. So concentration multiplied by time.
There's a couple of warehouses that popped up doing the radiation too now.
Yeah, irradiation.
Yeah, they irradiate their stock.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I got asked, a big contract a few years ago, you know, give us some advice on irradiation. I gave them advice on everything else and we fixed the problem, but I said I don't know much about it, so yeah. I don't know how well it works or how well it doesn't. So, what's another anovia that we can think of besides cigarette beetle and drugstore beetle?
Furniture beetle?
Pardon?
Furniture beetle?
Yeah. So Anovium punctata, we all remember that? So it's in the same family. So cigarette beetles and drugstore beetles will pupate sometimes in timber and cardboard, stuff like that. So the drugstore beetle, for instance, they found in a museum, I think it was, archives in a museum overseas somewhere a long time ago, a few decades ago. They had all these ancient manuscripts, these books, up on shelves that were stored, and they had drugstore beetles in there that went from the end of the book pile right the way through to the other end.
Wow.
Yeah. And dermestids. So the other dermestid beetles are the larder beetles and the carpet beetles. So skins, hides, feathers, so anything with keratin in it, you know, that protein keratin. And that's what, you know, carpet beetles look for, right too. All the natural fibres, so cotton, wool and all that, they won't go for synthetic carpet, for instance. Good. Yeah, carpet beetles there. Yeah, so this is just a few slides about where to put them. So when we've found the ones that we want to use, or we know the pests we want to monitor for, we've got to work out our positioning. And really, if we've got situations like this, we've got to make sure that we use a trap that's going to hopefully keep all that flower dust and everything out. It's just really a hard gig sometimes.
One big petri dish.
Yeah. And outside, you know, we talked about putting them outside yesterday. So we want to keep them out of the rain and the sun and the UV where possible. Lost species. As we said, pheromones are, so the sex pheromones are more powerful generally than the aggregation pheromones, which means that we can space the lures further apart with the sex pheromones than the aggregation pheromones. So again, we've got this information on the product labels, but rules of thumb, because they do vary, generally for the sex pheromones, 12 metres apart, like on a grid pattern, right? and for the aggregation pheromones, about 8 metres apart on a grid pattern. Now you'll go and get a product and it'll say something different to that, but you'll also go get another product and it'll say something different, then you'll go and get another product and it might say that. So this is, again, this is a happy medium, a benchmark or a rule of thumb to go off. So the aggregation pheromones, 12 metres grid pattern, the sex pheromones are 8 metre grid pattern. Good? The shelf life of these products is about 2 years in general, again. So when you buy them, you can store them for about 2 years. Then they reckon that you've got to throw them away and buy more. But remember I told you the other day about the 10-year-old ones that I've got that still work well. And when you put them in the field, depending on the conditions, we don't want all that flower dust and everything around, but normal conditions, about 3 months they last, and then it's time to change them. And we'll get to something else in a sec. So, I've got there, see that second sentence, so too many sex pheromones wafting around or lures too close together may only confuse and even repel moths. So with that mating disruption strategy that we were talking about earlier, you know, with all the pheromones everywhere, that's what happens. They get confused, they can even repel. I've read stuff where it repels them, there's so much of it around. And of course they can't zero in, they can't find any females then. And they can't find the traps, which is probably worse because then we've got no data. Okay. So, we just discussed this. Shelf life, say most of 2 years. They're active for 8 to 12 weeks. Where to install them, that's pretty obvious. How many to install? 8 metre grid pattern for calling insects, or actually that should really read for aggregation pheromones. Should change that actually. And 12 to 15, say, for sex pheromone lures. Any questions? Positioning, yeah. We discussed this yesterday, remember? Similar to EFTs, light units. Sanitation, cleaning, so the effectiveness of pheromone monitoring can be severely compromised by bad housekeeping, like everything can be. Like if you got pheromone traps up, big program up, and you got shitty housekeeping with all these food attractants everywhere, that's going to affect the trap catches. Like you're going to get on your traps. That's like logical, yeah? Okay, what info should we write on the lures? So you know how we've got them up everywhere. What info should we have on them? Because, you know, I've seen places where they'll go in, like particularly with at the hanging ones, and they're cardboard, so they can write on them, right, with a pen. And then they've got the installation date, and then they've got trap numbers, catch numbers on them this week, and the week before that, the week. So you've got all this information on these traps that doesn't look very good to the customer. And customers don't really like seeing bugs on pheromone traps, most customers. Because they think, what are these pesties doing? We've got bugs in here, right? I mean, they're in there to catch them. And they could be brought in by deliveries or coming through doors that they don't want to keep shut and all the rest of it. But commonly what they'll do is, oh you. So, really the info to put on these pheromone lures is the date that you install them. Simple, straightforward, and you can come back and check that, you walk around. You know, the trap catches you're going to put on your pest monitoring strips anyway, so if you've got the date it was installed, you know straight off, oh, this needs changing. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a few photos. That's a flour mill. Yeah, so their housekeeping's pretty good.
Seems like a few on my site.
So not only store product insects, but they had a big problem with rodents like you've never seen. The train would come in with the big carriage buckets, you know, whatever you call them, on the train, and they would just like pile so high with grain, with wheat, and they just had tarps over and pulled down, but it was just spilling off everywhere, and they'd pull in on the railway line to the back of the flour mill, and there'd be just hundreds of rats just jumping out off every car, you know, it's amazing. And then they have all that stuff laying around there everywhere. Okay. Always wear gloves when you're handling the pheromones, otherwise you'll end up with the pheromones on your clothes, and then you'll have Indian meal moths chasing around after you. Create a site map. We discussed all this. Now we know to put it on the site maps, all of our lures on the site maps. Okay. Always look at the condition of the traps. So if there's one trap out of a few with no catches on it, there must be a reason. It could be that it's located away from the activity, or that the lure has lost its potency, and we'll get to that in a minute. There could be a fine layer of dust or flour over the glue surface, so the insects can't adhere to it. The trap may be positioned too close to air currents from doors. So, you know, the trap's here, the door's there. Every time the door's open, the currents go in and take the pheromone odours away. So it's not working and attracting the insects like it should be. And if it's a pitfall trap down on the floor, there may be water laying around it, which means the insects won't go across the water to get to the trap, all these sorts of things. And if it's a flat glue board type floor trap, the height of the glue layer edges may be too high. So quite often, and bed bugs used to do this, they'd come up to a glue trap and they'd sense the glue on the edge of it and they'd back off sometimes. And that's what stored product insects do sometimes. So all those factors can deter target pests from the trap. How often should lures be checked? History of pest problems. So we discussed all this yesterday. So the rule of thumb, summer weekly, winter monthly, and spring and autumn 2 weekly. Just as a rule of thumb. But if you're servicing a place at 2 weekly intervals, you're not going to be able to change the lures every week or check the lures every week, are you? In summer. So, you know, there is limitations with that as well. But again, that's just a rule of thumb. So, as the lures are out there working, the manufacturers, which we've discussed, state that you should change them every 3 months. So they want you to go, take them down, throw them away and put new ones up every 3 months. It's always a good idea to keep some of those used ones and stick them in, say, a Ziploc bag. And the reason is that, let's just say we've got a warehouse like this. That's not a high warehouse, but it'll do. So that's a long warehouse. So let's just say that we've got our sex pheromones on a 12-metre grid pattern, right? So it's 12 metres between the traps. And on a couple of those traps, we're getting, or even one, we're getting, let's say, Indian meal moth, to make it simple. Where's it coming from? So 12 metres, there's a lot of pallets within 12-metre space, right? This way, a couple of rows that way, a couple of rows this way. And if there's 6 pallets high instead of 4, where is that infestation? Well, we don't know yet. It could be up. So, what can help us? Like, we can get the forklift drivers and say, okay, we need to get every pallet and look at it within a 12-metre circumference or radius, right? But that would take forever. So, those pheromone lures that now have lost a fair bit of their pheromone because they've been out for 3 months, and you've got them in a bag, you can put them between
close together.
the 12 metre spacings, right? And they'll only work over a shorter period. So instead of attracting moths in from say 12 metres, they might only attract them in from 3. So that you put a few of them in between those 12 metre spacings, and you're monitoring more closely on a tighter ratio, if you like. Does that make sense? So you can do that and play around with them a little bit, and eventually you might get them. You might get them within say 4 pallets or something, because outside of those, you've got these used pheromone lures that they're not catching anything, but you've got a few here within this little area of 4 pallets, so the infestation is likely there. So it just helps you to pinpoint where the activity might be. Make sense? Anybody didn't understand that? I don't know whether I explained it well enough. Yeah? Okay, we know, we did this yesterday. I think we went through this, didn't we? Yeah. What's a trend analysis? We discussed that yesterday. Yeah. Yeah. An action response. We discussed that too. Trials. So there's a couple of trials I did. So this one was manufactured in November 2012, and I set it up in February of 2016, so 3.5 years later, and they say that they're only good for 2 years, right? And it was never, so it wasn't used, it was just sitting in the box. So I stuck it up 3.5, so you can say a year and a half after it theoretically expired, I stuck it up, and within 1 month I got all those Indian meal moths on it. That's results after 2 months. This was a little RTU inspector for moths and tobacco beetles, so I set that up March of 2016. That was 4 weeks later. It had a skink in there too, obviously it was eating the moths. So it was way out of date as well. That was years out of date.
No, poor little.
And so do they work with and without? So Indian meal moths, so 2 weeks after installation, installed on the 18th of October, I installed both of these. This one had the pheromone lure. Yeah, that's one of those little capsules. And this was just a sticky board without the pheromone. So obviously, the trap catches vary so much. So the pheromone's obviously doing the work. And 3 months after, this was 12 months, yeah, so they were 12 months past the expiry date. So that was 3 months after install with the pheromone. And this was a sticky board, right, that on the 15th of December, 2 months after, October, November, December, and I stuck a tablet in there, a food attractant tablet, and still the trap catches were just varied so much. So that's pretty obvious that the pheromones work well. So the final trap catches were 118 as opposed to 10 without the pheromone. Why use pheromones? We've been through that. Any questions? And we can have morning tea. It's 10 minutes early, but we can have morning tea and then come back a little bit early. Thanks, guys. Should be some food there.
Hey, there you go.
I got the QR codes
Yeah.
made up already.
Oh,
So you did this one?
Top one?
Yep.
Sure.
changed information.
What information?
The 6 pheromone went from 8 metre grid to 12 metre grid, back to 8 metre grid, back to 12 metre grid. So which is it, 8 to 12?
Yeah.
And the information one.
That's short and long. But they're all short again.
Yes. I was just, yeah, okay. So I'm wondering which answer we do. Do we go for the original one, or do we go for the one you changed it to? So I would have thought the sex pheromone would have gone on the 12 metre grid, and the aggregation go on an 8 metre grid.
That's what it said, isn't it?
But he changed it
Oh, really?
twice.
Oh,
So
okay, I didn't notice.
Originally it was